We talked of belief in ghosts. He said, "Sir, I make a distinction between what a man may experience by the mere strength of his imagination and what imagination cannot possibly produce. Thus, suppose I should think that I saw a form and heard a voice cry, 'Johnson, you are a very wicked fellow, and unless you repent you will certainly be punished.' My own unworthiness is so deeply impressed upon my mind that I might imagine I thus saw and heard, and therefore I should not believe that an external communication had been made to me. But if a form should appear and a voice should tell me that a particular man has died at a particular place in a particular hour, a fact which I had no apprehension of, nor any means of knowing, and this fact, with all its circumstances, should afterwards be unquestionably proved, I should, in this case, be persuaded that I had supernatural intelligence imparted to me." Here it is proper, once for all, to give a true and fair statement of Johnson's way of thinking upon the question, whether the departed spirits are ever permitted to appear in this world, or in any way to operate upon human life. He has been ignorantly misrepresented as weakly credulous upon that subject, and therefore though I feel an inclination to disdain and treat with silent contempt so foolish a notion concerning my illustrious friend, yet as I find it has gained ground, it is necessary to refute it. The real fact, then, is that Johnson had a very philosophical mind, and such a rational respect for testimony as to make him submit his understanding to what he was authentically proved, though he could not comprehend why it was so. Being thus disposed, he was willing to inquire into the truth of any relation of supernatural agency, a general belief of which had prevailed in all nations and ages. But so far was he from being the dupe of implicit faith that he examined the matter with their jealous attention, and no man was more ready to refute its falsehood when he had discovered it. Churchill, in his poems entitled "The Ghost," availed himself of the absurd credulity imputed to Johnson, and drew a caricature of him under the name of Pomposo, representing him as one of the believers of the story of a ghost in Cock Lane, which, in the year 1762, had gained very general credit in London. Many of my readers, I am convinced, are to this hour under an impression that Johnson was thus foolishly deceived. It will therefore surprise them a good deal when they are informed upon undoubted authority that Johnson was one of those by whom the imposture was detected. The story had become so popular that he thought it should be investigated. Oh, Johnson's a ghost hunter. That's kind of cool. And in this research he was assisted by the Reverend Dr. Douglas, now Bishop of Salisbury, the great detector of impostors, who informed me that after the gentlemen who went and examined the evidence were satisfied of its falsity, Johnson wrote in their presence an account of it, which was published in the newspapers and Gentleman's Magazine, and undeceived the world. Footnote here. The account was as follows. On the night of the 1st of February, 1762, many gentlemen eminent from their rank and character were, by the invitation of the Reverend Mr. Aldrich of Clerkenwell, assembled at the house for the examination of the noises supposed to be made by a departed spirit for the detection of some enormous crime. About 10 at night, the gentlemen met in the chamber in which the girl, supposed to be disturbed by the spirit, had, with proper caution, been put to bed by several ladies. They sat rather more than an hour, and hearing nothing, went downstairs, when they interrogated the father of the girl, who denied, in the strongest terms, any knowledge or belief of fraud. The supposed spirit had been publicly promised by an affirmative knock that it would attend one of the gentlemen into the vault under the church of St. John, Clerkenwell, where the body is deposited, and give a token of her presence there by a knock upon her coffin. It was therefore determined to make the trial of the existence of or veracity of the supposed spirit. While they were inquiring and deliberating, they were summoned into the girl's chamber by some ladies who were near her bed and who had heard knocks and scratches. When the gentleman entered, the girl declared that she felt the spirit like a mouse upon her back, and was required to hold her hands out of bed. From that time, though the spirit was very solemnly required to manifest its existence by appearance, by impression on the hand or body of any present, by scratches, knocks, or any other agency, no evidence of any preternatural power was exhibited. The spirit was then very seriously advertised that the person to whom the promise was made of striking the coffin was then about to visit the vault, and that the performance of the promise was then claimed. The company at 1 o'clock went into the church, and the gentleman to whom the promise was made went with another into the vault. The spirit was solemnly required to perform its promise, but nothing more than silence ensued. The person supposed to be accused by the spirit then went down with several others, but no effect was perceived. Upon their return, they examined the girl, but could draw no confession from her. Between 2 and 3, she desired it and was permitted to go home with her father. It is therefore the opinion of the whole assembly that the child has some sort of art of making or counterfeiting a particular noise, and that there is no agency of any higher cause. Anyway, our conversation proceeded. "Sir," said Johnson, "I am a friend to subordination, as most conducive to the happiness of society. There is a reciprocal pleasure in governing and being governed. Dr. Goldsmith is one of the first men who now have as an author, and he is who we now have as an author, and he is a very worthy man too. He has been loose in his principles, but he is coming right. I mentioned Mallet's tragedy of Elvira, which had been acted in preceding winter at Drury Lane, and that the Honourable Andrew Erskine, Mr. Dempster, and myself had joined in writing a pamphlet entitled Critical Strictures against it. The critical review, in which Mallet himself sometimes wrote, characterized this pamphlet as the crude effects of envy, petulance, and self-conceit. There being thus 3 epithets, we, the 3 authors, had a humorous contention of how each should be appropriated. Boswell, I'm going to give you self-conceit. He seems a little... Of envy, petulance, and self-conceit, I think Boswell's the most self-conceited one. Anyway, that the minus of Dempster's disposition had, however, relented, and he had candidly said, "We have hardly a right to abuse this tragedy, for bad as it is, how vain should either of us to write one not near so good." So anyway, yeah, so in case you're lost here, Andrew Erskine, Mr. Dempster, and Boswell wrote a bad review of Elvira, a play by Mallet. And Dempster later on said, well, I shouldn't have judged it because, you know, neither of us could write as something as good. And then Johnson replied, "Why, no, sir, this is not just reasoning. You may abuse a tragedy, though you cannot write one. You may scold a carpenter who has made you a bad table, though you cannot make a table. It is not your trade to make tables." Hey, he makes a good point there. When I talked of the paternal estate to which I was heir, he said, "Sir, let me tell you that to be a Scotch landlord, where you have a number of families dependent upon you and attached to you, is perhaps as high a situation as humanity can arrive at. A merchant upon the Change of London, with £100,000 is nothing. An English duke, with an immense fortune, is nothing. He has no tenants who consider themselves as under his patriarchal care, and who will follow him to the field upon any emergency." His notion of the dignity of a Scotch landlord had been formed upon what he had heard of the Highland chiefs. For it is long since a lowland landlord who has been so curtailed in his feudal authority that he has little more influence over his tenants than an English landlord. And of late years, most of the Highland chiefs have destroyed, by means too well known, the princely power which they once enjoyed. Johnson proceeded. Your going abroad, sir, and breaking off idle habits may be a great importance to you. I would go where there are courts and learned men. There is a good deal of Spain that has not been perambulated. I would have you go thither. A man of inferior talents to yours may furnish us with useful observations upon that country. His supposing me, as that period of life, capable of writing an account of my travels that would deserve to be read, elated me not a little. I appeal to every impartial reader, whether this faithful detail of his frankness, complacency, and kindness to a young man, a stranger and a Scotchman, does not refute the unjust opinion of the harshness of his general demeanor. His occasional reproofs of folly, impudence, or impiety, and even the sudden sallies of his constitutional irritability of temper, which have been preserved for the poignancy of their wit, have produced that opinion among those who have not considered that such instances, though collected by Mrs. Piozzi into a small volume, and read over in a few hours, were in fact scattered through a long series of years. Years in which his time was chiefly spent in instructing and delighting mankind by his writings and conversation, in acts of piety to God and goodwill to men. I complained to him that I had not yet acquired much knowledge, and asked his advice as to my studies. He said, "Don't talk of study now. I will give you a plan, but it will require some time to consider of it." "It is very good of you," I replied, "to allow me to be with you thus. Had it been foretold to me some years ago that I should pass an evening with the author of The Rambler, how should I have exulted?" My challenge for you today is to use the word exalted in a conversation with somebody. What I then expressed was sincerely from the heart. He was satisfied that it was, and cordially answered, "Sir, I am glad we have met. I hope we shall pass many evenings and mornings too together." We finished a couple of bottles of port, and sat till between 1 or 2 in the morning. He wrote this here, in the critical review, the account of Telemachus, a Mask, by the Reverend George Graham of Eden College. The subject of this beautiful poem was particularly interesting to Johnson, who had much experience of the conflict of opposite principles, which he describes as the contention between pleasure and virtue, a struggle which will always be continued while the present system of nature shall subsist. Nor can history or poetry exhibit more than a pleasure triumphing over virtue, and virtue subjugating pleasure. As Dr. Oliver Goldsmith will frequently appear in this narrative, I shall endeavor to make my readers in some degree acquainted with his singular character. He was a native of Ireland, and a contemporary with Mr. Burke of Trinity College, Dublin, but did not then give much promise of future celebrity. He, however, observed to Mr. Malone that, though he made no great figure in mathematics, which was a study in much repute there, he could turn an ode of Horace into English better than any of them. He afterwards studied physics at Edinburgh and upon the continent, and I have been informed was enabled to pursue his travels on foot, partly by demanding at universities to enter the list as a disputant, by which, according to the custom of many of them, he was entitled to the premium of a crown, which, when luckily for him his challenge was not accepted. So that, as I once observed to Dr. Johnson, he disputed his passage through Europe. I don't understand that. He then came to England and was employed successfully in the capacities of an usher to an academy, a corrector of the press, a reviewer, and a writer for a newspaper. He had sagacity enough, or sagacity, I don't know, sage-ity, enough to cultivate assiduously the acquaintance of Johnson, and his faculties were gradually enlarged by the contemplation of such a model. To me and many others, it appeared that he studiously copied the manner of Johnson, though, indeed, upon a smaller scale. At this time, I think he had published nothing with his name, though it was pretty generally known that one Dr. Goldsmith was the author of An Inquiry into the Present State of Polite Learning in Europe, and of The Citizen of the World, a series of letters supposed to be written from London by a Chinese. No man had this art of displaying with more advantage as a writer what the literary acquisitions he made. Nihil quod telegit non obdebat. He touched nothing that he did not adorn. His mind resembled a fertile but thin soil. There was a quick but not a strong vegetation of whatever chanced to be thrown upon it. No deep root could be struck. The oak of the forest did not grow there, but the elegant shrubbery and the fragrant parterre appeared in gay succession. Wow, what a put-down. It has been generally circulated and believed that he was a mere fool in conversation, but in truth, this has been greatly exaggerated. Anyway, allusion to him being a fool is this. Mr. Horace Walpole, who admired his writings, said he was an inspired idiot, and Garrick described him as one for shortness called Noel, who wrote like an angel and talked like poor Pole. Sir Joshua Reynolds mentioned to me that he infrequently heard Goldsmith talk warmly of the pleasure of being liked, and observe how hard it would be if literary excellence should preclude a man from that satisfaction, which he perceived as it often did, from the envy which attended it. And therefore Sir Joshua was convinced that he was intentionally more absurd in order to lessen himself in social intercourse, trusting that his character would be sufficiently supported by his works. If it indeed was his intention to appear absurd in company, he was often very successful. But with due deference to Sir Joshua's ingenuity, I think the conjecture too refined. Anyway, he had, no doubt, a more than common share of that hurry of ideas which we often find in his countrymen. I guess he's talking about the Irish people here, and which sometimes produces a laughable confusion in expressing them. He was very much what the French call un étourdi, and from vanity and an eager desire of being conspicuous wherever he was, he frequently talked carelessly without knowledge of the subject, or even without thought. His person was short, his countenance coarse and vulgar, his deportment that of a scholar awkwardly affecting the easy gentleman. Those who were in any way distinguished excited envy in him to so ridiculous an excess that the instances of it are hardly credible. When accompanying two beautiful young ladies, Miss Hornex, one of whom is now married to Henry Bunbury, Esquire, and the other to Colonel Gwyn, with their mother on a tour and in France, he was seriously angry that more attention was paid to them than to him. And once at the exhibition of the Fantoccini in London, when those who sat next to him observed with what dexterity a puppet was made to toss a pike, he could not bear that it should have such praise, and exclaimed with some warmth, "Pshaw! I can do it better myself." That's pretty funny. He went home with Mr. Burke to supper, and broke his shin by attempting to exhibit to the company how much better he could jump over a stick than the puppets. That's pretty funny. Well, maybe I'll leave it at that. Until next time, bye from Boswell.